Good afternoon, everyone. Well, on the way back from Hong Kong, just now, I just landed the plane. I actually prepared a wonderful speech too, but given the time constraints, so I'll keep it very short. I've also, please bear with me, somewhere along the flight, I lost my voice as well. So there are a lot of constraints in my sharing this afternoon. When I look at the topic on ecosystem, the first thing that came to my mind, and being an environmental economist, I thought this would be on the natural system and the living organisms and livability and so on. And when I was in Hong Kong, I was looking through the PPT slides of the speakers. And so I said to myself, well, there's nothing on the real natural ecosystem. So I had it wrong because ecosystem obviously involve a different kind of connotation, definition, and so on. And I was very happy actually, just about as I entered here about 3:10, to look at the slides that came in. I just saw the slides because in Hong Kong I've missed one set of slides, and that is from John Powers. And I realized that he's going to talk a little bit on the ecosystem as I know it, which is involving the natural environment, the livability, the sustainability, and so on. So we do have one aspect of it. Now there are 6 speakers, so quite a lot of speakers, and I know they've been allocated 10 minutes, and I also know, and I've been reminded many times, that they need this room by 5 o'clock, and therefore I will have to exercise the power of the chairman to cut everybody's speech to 8 minutes, so we'll leave enough time. So 2 times 6, I will have about 12, plus now another 10, I have 20 minutes at least of the Q&A. And so I think most of the other speakers are talking about the new, the world in which we are going to and we are living in. Most of us here are born in an era where we are familiar with the internet generation. And that's in the later part of the 20th century. But now we're entering into all kinds of revolution, which is like digital revolution, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, and we're going to hear about the sharing and the maker economy. So a lot of exciting things which will come to us and to our children in this century. So let's hear from each and every one of them as they talk about the ecosystem of the future economy. I begin with the order that is in the printout. So John Powers is the first speaker. John Powers is a research fellow with the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. You can read a lot of his bio in the materials provided. So let's start with John.
Thank you, Professor Quah. Good afternoon, everybody. Is this the, okay. Happy to be here to talk to you today about some thoughts on the innovative ecosystems and some work we've been doing at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities. What I'm going to be talking about today is going to start briefly with some definitional concepts and discuss some of the key underlying assumptions about ecosystems and how they're presumed to operate. I'm then going to talk about the Future of the Economy study, which we've just completed, and some survey work pertaining to innovation and R&D in Singapore, which is part of a larger project we have called the Future of Cities Project, which is funded primarily by NRF. And then if I have time, I'm going to end with some thoughts about how planning and policy are coming together to support innovation in New York and in London. So this is one of the probably most famous quoted statements in economics. Curiously, it is almost never cited by actual economists themselves. So great are the advantages which people following the same skilled trade get from near neighborhood to one another. The mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. Now, the ideas behind this statement have generated an enormous amount of scholarly research on industrial districts and innovation districts and pertain largely to the many tangible and intangible factors, the way economic space, geography, proximity come together with economic production. And this, in many ways, is one of the core planning rationales for developing innovative ecosystems, which I'm going to speak about. So what are some working definitions of an innovative ecosystem? Well, we generally assert that it's basically about the way that social institutions are created and how they support each other. Now, here you have a basic snapshot of an innovative ecosystem, the way we define it in Singapore. I'm not going to go into the details of the constituent parts of each of these systems, but the key idea here is really that at the end of the day, it's about how linked up these different component parts of the system are, with the underlying presumption that the more connected they are, the more able, the more efficiently economy can turn resources into actual economic advantage. So what have we been doing? In August of 2015, as part of the Future of the Economy study, we launched a innovation survey with the help of A-STAR. The intention was to link it to A-STAR's annual survey of R&D activity in Singapore, but this was not able to happen for a couple of reasons. So we ended up with a smaller sample of about 100 respondents, which is about 1/8 of what the agency captures annually in its survey of R&D. Now, the objective was really to look at concrete cases of where we have interconnectedness and relational ties being created in the innovative process and R&D activity in Singapore. And I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The first is really about the structure of the labor pool and the way that R&D labor is sourced. Next, I'll talk about relational or informal contracting or networking, and then formal contracting for R&D, and then I'll finish by discussing some spatial, how some of this is playing out spatially. We see this as a void, really, in the way that in our current understanding in Singapore of how science and technology policy, industrial estate planning, and broader notions of innovation are really coming together. So we had a good representation of the SME sector, which we regard as very positive, as well as the biomedical and life sciences was also fairly well represented, despite the overwhelming presence of engineering and technology in the sample. So the first area pertaining to R&D labor, which has significant bearing for the rate, the direction, and the way that firms react to labor mobility, labor churn. We wanted to understand the sources of R&D labor, where firms are getting their human capital from. So we're working up some typologies. On the local side, we looked at foreign firms operating in Singapore, local large enterprises, SMEs, and of course, Singaporean universities. On the foreign side, we're talking about direct hiring from foreign firms as well as directly from foreign universities. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but in a manner consistent with what A-STAR finds out almost every year, the overwhelming share of R&D labor is locally sourced, but with different configurations in terms of the way firms are organizing themselves from a human capital standpoint. Okay, so on relational contracting, informal contracting, networking, we asked firms what reasons, what motivations do they engage in knowledge sharing behavior? So we devised some data categories, and it was very interesting because I can't go into all of them, but we provided them with the opportunity to give some qualitative responses. And all of them talk the language of collaboration, of alliance formation, of a need to engage outside the firm, a need to create ties with other firms. Really textbook positive answers. Now, how is this actually translating? How is this borne out in terms of contracting for actual formal contracting for actual R&D work? This is, an important part of understanding, is there a market for knowledge-based services and R&D services emerging in Singapore? So what we did was to break out research, separate the R from the D, and break it into some of its component parts. And we did this in a manner consistent with the OECD's Frescati manual, which sets out international guidelines for doing survey work on R&D activity. And overall, although most firms have some minimal experience with formal contracting for R&D, we found that the evidence overall is really quite thin. It tends to be focused on the development side, such as developing prototypes, things that are closer to the market. Research activity, the evidence for it, contracting is very thin, so it tends to be more between a firm and public research institutes, such as A-STAR, rather than a business-to-business phenomenon. So here, I just want to quickly show you some spatial relationships about contracting, which we broke down again into some component parts, and see how it plays out spatially. This gets us back to kind of Marshall's idea about proximity and its relationship to innovation. And what we see, these are two basic typologies, but ones that were really quite common in the sample, is that we see a pattern of dispersal rather than one of concentration. Now this gets us into thinking, what are our science parks and hubs really about at the end of the day? These developments are developed all over the world, but predicated on the idea that they're going to produce these collaborative, synergistic, interactions. And so far, our evidence really doesn't show this to be the case. Now, our new deputy chairman, the board of trustees at SUTD, Mr. Lee Soo-young, has, mentioned that co-location of firms simply isn't enough, even in the same industry. And what you really need is what he calls a curator, somebody to nurture these, these interactions of effects between firms. Now, very quickly, I just want to end with two slides on what's happening in New York and London. In New York, in an environment apart from financial services, property is really king. The administration of Mayor Bloomberg has been highly activist in promoting ecosystem development. It's done so by very large-scale urban redevelopment. The Brooklyn Tech Triangle, the new campus at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, as well as the Roosevelt Island Cornell Technion campus for applied science, and linking this to the innovation economy. Also, creating affordable space for startups is extremely important, and you can see this in the employment data, where New York's technology employment is outpacing either the city overall and the U.S. national average. So last slide. Quickly on London, different concept, much more of an organic process of urban development with regard to the innovation economy. There's a new area called Tech City, which is developing in an area that was once considered on the urban fringe of economic activity. But with a light touch planning system and flexible land use controls, this has given great momentum to some organic, innovative economic activity in London, which basically leaves me with a question, what space do we have in Singapore for the unplanned, and to what extent can it coexist with the top-down approach to much economic and city planning? Do we have room for it? Is it desirable? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Powers. Economies.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I just want to say that the content of my talk really rests on three main ideas. And then after that, I'll state a bunch of actionable recommendations that stems from the outcome of the three ideas and the combinations of these three ideas. But before I start the talk proper, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues who are co-authors of this paper, as well as various staff and students of SIT who lend conversation and give us ideas to put into the paper. So I think any conversation about the future economy often focuses on high tech. That's very exciting, that's very sexy, you can say. But the economy is really not all about high tech. In fact, if you think about it, maybe high tech will only occupy not such a high proportion of the economy. So what are we doing about the rest of it? Furthermore, not everyone can or wants to work in high tech. And so we are talking about the people that you cannot train everybody to do computing, everybody will operate robots and invent robots and software and so on and so forth. And really, high tech needs complementary human touch. And that's the level that we also must look into, a level that we must push up to the next level. I think that even when the robots got to be very clever, I don't think that when you're on your sick bed, you really want a robot to take care of you. You still want a nurse, you still want people around. No doubt they'll operate on much more automated systems and devices, but you still want that human touch. So I think it's important that we look at the high touch part of it. And I ask the question again, do you really want robots to bring up your kid? Don't you want the teacher to be there, a human person? And for that person then to use some devices that helps put the knowledge more quickly into the hands of the teacher. So really, it's high tech cannot be all there is in terms of for the future economy. And there's a lot of high-touch industries that people would still want to have that human touch. You want it to be very personalized. You want it to be very good, very interactive. Hospitality, culinary, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that high-tech and high-touch are not mutually exclusive. Don't get the wrong idea that if it's not not high-tech, then or high-touch is low-tech. Okay. So I give you an example here. In a case of hair salon, in the good old days, you go and the barber cut your hair according to maybe just one style that the barber is familiar with. But in the future, you go into a hair salon, you have a computer that captures the shape of your face, how your eyebrows look on your face, etc., and perhaps come up with a series of possibility for a hairstylist to have a discussion with a customer. And have a discussion of advantage and disadvantage which one. And then finally, you decide on the hairstyle. And then it's important that the hairstylist must be competent to do the haircut. It's no good having, you have this image of how you will look in this new hairstyle, and then the hairstylist make a mess of it. So really, it's a combination of high-tech and high-touch. The second idea really talks about focus on the region. In the 70s, Singapore leapfrogged over the region. We looked to the first world countries like USA and Japan and countries in Europe. And then in the 90s, we look at big economies like China and India that are growing very, very rapidly. So what next? Well, our suggestion is that the third wave is that we should look in our own backyard. We should look at the ASEAN countries. Because ASEAN has got 620 million people, bigger than USA, bigger than Europe. And the GDP is 2.5 trillion, 2014. But more importantly, in this region, it's growing economy, it's a growing middle class, it's a large young population. Unlike the countries I mentioned, they're all facing an aging population, perhaps with the exception of India. But the rest face an aging population situation. And I think Singapore brand name is very, very good. So we need to focus on the region. The third idea is that SMEs needs to be the new engine of growth. SMEs employ 70% of the workforce, but only provide 50% of the economic output. And the SME need to move beyond just supporting MNCs. The MNCs, we cannot do without them, but the SMEs need to grow. They need to grow in terms of the depth, in terms of breadth, in terms of strength, in terms of size, and sort of move up and down the value chain. We must think of them more, the model like the Mittelstand companies in Germany, where the bigger companies need the SMEs. So our SME need to grow in that way. I'll use an analogy to illustrate my point. I think that when you think of mee pok, okay, as far as for me, mee pok tastes as good as ramen. But what happened to ramen? Ramen, the Japanese are able to project their brand globally, okay? And then they oftentimes, you think of ramen, it's got very high quality, very consistent quality, diversity, but yet you have a certain expectation. But more importantly, a bowl of ramen costs a lot more than a bowl of mee pok. So in the same analogy, our SME need to grow that way. They need to grow in terms of quality. They need to grow in terms of consistency. They need to project the brand name beyond Singapore shores. So it's not just a part of a MNC. It's almost like having the branding, it's Intel inside. So SMEs got to grow, really take the next leap. So we use the word that mee pok must become ramen. Then we are told that we must give actionable recommendations, not give very broad recommendations. So I have 6 recommendations, which I'll run through very quickly. I should make it in time within the 10 minutes. First thing is, like I said, okay, we focus not just on high tech, but we need to focus on high touch. But more importantly, focus on the combination in terms of education, high touch plus high tech. So for example, in the hospitality business, you focus on how should you harness technology in the front office as well as the back end, especially the back end. So many things you can do in terms of logistics, in terms of booking, and so on and so forth. We need to encourage our students to go out into a region. I think a lot of times people don't want to go out. They feel safer, more comfortable in Singapore. We need to encourage our young people to go out there and have Singapore grow the external wing. If we don't encourage our young people to do that, don't succeed in encouraging them, I think we'll be in trouble. The third recommendation is that we really need to draw people from the region to come to Singapore. We are going to face sort of reducing, because of our reducing birth rate, smaller and smaller cohorts of students. So we can draw in terms of training and education for students who come from a region into Singapore. I think the question is that, are we therefore taking away places away from our local Singaporeans? Because of the declining birth rate, a smaller cohort, the IHL has got capacity for them to take in more foreign students. The idea is, in the past, we always think of taking in foreign students, then they grow a Singapore economy. But it's more than that, because if they go back out in the region, their classmates who are Singaporean, therefore when they go into a region, they will have the network. So I think that's very important, that we rethink that we should draw people into Singapore. How do Singapore, as a brand name, a good education system, draw people into Singapore? Then the fourth one is really about inculcating a mindset for both entrepreneur and entrepreneur. Because for entrepreneurs, a lot of universities are focusing on that. But you know that to start a new company, we talk about startup, the value of death is, the success rate is 1 in 20, 1 in 100. And maybe it is easier, okay, that we tell our young people that they go and join an SME, help grow it to the next level, rather than just always think of starting up. Because the idea is that join a company and figure out how you can grow the company in terms of new areas to go into and so on and so forth. So it's still an entrepreneurial mindset, but already planted in a company that is already successful, or will become more successful, already has a business, ongoing business that's got income stream, and not just think of joining MNCs. Okay, very quickly, 2 more recommendations. Really, first, we have done very well. Singapore has a lot of networks for overseas who are always reaching out to overseas Singaporeans. But the idea is that it's only networking creating the opportunity. I think we have to do more. We have to expand the role of this network so that these people in that network will help to mentor our students when they go out. And these people need not all be Singaporeans overseas. It also be people in the region who are very well connected to Singapore, who have got business branches and so on here in Singapore. We need to nurture that the mindset is beyond networking, but more of mentoring, and we need to do that. And then one of the big issues is really about people not wanting to go out. They always worry, my children, are they going to get education? I will go to a more ulu area, is it going to be good enough healthcare? So we really need to partnership maybe with private sector or even the government take the lead and go and create more Singapore schools, Singapore-style school and healthcare facilities. So summarizing, we need to leverage on both high-tech and high-touch and leave no one behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, first I want to say this is a collaborative effort from a large team at SIM University. I'm just a messenger, but you can feel free to shoot me if you want. Okay. So really, we're going to talk about three broad thrusts here, and we overall call this future service industries. Okay? So the broad thrusts are predictive technologies, mobility, lifestyle, and education as a service. So what are these things? For the first area, predictive technologies, I think many of us are familiar now with what it's all about. This is basically using the power of analytics and big data to make predictions about your customers, about policy decisions. So there's a story about this. In the US, for example, a lot of the big chain stores have a lot of data on consumer purchasing patterns. And they use this purchasing data to try and figure out what's going to happen to your household so that they can send you targeted advertising. One of the things they're very keen on is to know whether there's a change in your household composition. For example, is somebody pregnant? Is there a new addition to the household? That's because you change your purchasing patterns then. And when they can detect this, they send out the advertising to your household to try and figure out, okay, do you want to buy more diapers? Do you want to buy some, like baby shampoo, stuff like that? So all this works well, except when they predict wrongly or when they predict the change in your household before you even know about it. So there was a story about a parent in the US who was very annoyed when they got this advertising suggesting they want to buy kid stuff, but he found out later that it was because his teenage daughter was pregnant and she hadn't told him yet. So that's the power of analytics there. But the next generation, of course, is integrating more and more data to understand decision-making in all aspects. Now, mobility lifestyle is the other key thrust. Currently, today, it's centered around improving our consumption opportunities for users in advanced countries. It's basically about making our first world lives better. But I think the next generation is going to be about using mobiles to shortcut economic development completely, to make developing economies more productive. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. The next area is going to be education as a service. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about MOOCs here or massively open online courses. I think to some extent they're really education as entertainment. It's difficult to establish that MOOCs have had a real impact on skills or on the economy. But I think what we need to be going in is the direction of giving more tailored, industry-relevant, and certifiable skills upgrades for Singaporeans and for the rest of the world. Okay? Now, why service industries? I think it's important we become a global leader in service industries. One reason is, of course, it complements high value-added manufacturing and engineering. Another reason is that it avoids growth constraints. We have limited manpower and space. It gives us good jobs, attracts the best talent worldwide. I think that's quite clear. But what's more interesting is that we have a lot of room, I think, to grow regionally. If you look at the OECD, about 21.5% of the share of the total trade is actually in services, and Singapore is a bit above this. But if you look at the region, we have a lot of room to grow. In some key regional economies, Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, there's still a lot of room to grow in terms of services trade. That's a niche that actually Singapore can fill with services exports to these regional powerhouses. Okay? Now, why some of these industries in particular? When we talk about predictive technologies and mobility lifestyle, it's really about improving productivity. Right? We have to acknowledge that input-driven growth is basically infeasible, but it's not just infeasible for us, it's increasingly becoming infeasible even for developing economies who are also going to be facing rapidly aging populations, and they just don't have the manpower to throw into the factories anymore. There are already slowdowns in China because they're running out of people in the villages to throw into the factories. Okay? So we have to try to leverage technology to improve productivity. For example, in predicting consumer behavior, you can cut waste, you have leaner inventories, leaner staffing. But when you think about policy context, you can also improve a lot. You can predict traffic better. You can schedule your deliveries or public delivery services during times of low traffic. But you can also, for example, predict hospital admissions. You can have leaner staffing. You can make more use out of your limited healthcare resources. In terms of the mobility lifestyle, we think the real potential here is in the emerging markets, where you have a large middle class which is going to go straight from having nothing at all to consuming things online. right? They're not going to be going through this brick and mortar phase that we are going through in Singapore. In Singapore today, we're going from being used to visiting the bank branch to doing our banking online. But if you're thinking about somebody in a village, for example, in Indonesia or Vietnam, they're going from having no bank branch to having their only contact with the bank being through their phone. So that's a real opportunity for growth here that we can be positioned to tap in Singapore. Okay? So these are some of the statistics that show us why we should be so optimistic about growth in the region in particular. For cell phones, they're pretty well saturated, but if you look at internet users, you can see that barely the surface has been scratched so far in some key regional economies, right? In India, Cambodia, Laos, basically less than 20 people out of every 100 have used the internet in the last year. We're not talking about having subscription for the internet. We're just talking about having used it for any purpose at all. And these countries are experiencing anywhere from 10 to 50% annualized growth rates year on year. The same thing is true with fixed broadband subscriptions as well. There's huge opportunity for growth here. So the growth story you see is not in Singapore, right? It's not even in Malaysia, and it's not in China either. It's actually to a large extent in these regional economic powerhouses which have the manpower, the consumer base, they have the room to grow. And we can get there first, basically, hopefully. Okay, why education as a service? Basically, the contemporary diploma and degree model is huge fixed costs. It requires a huge time commitment from people. It's an all-or-nothing package deal. I mean, it's how we're used to education, because frankly, education has always been delivered to the elites thus far. But is it the best model for others? Can it really scale cost effectively? And here I think we can really use technology and innovations in our practice to deliver education tailored for the individual and for industry's needs. It's going to be scalable both in the quantity of users as well as in the intensity of education. And we have to move away from MOOCs, which I think are a good first step, but not really where we're going to end up being. That's because MOOCs have high dropout or incomplete rates. They're not credible, they don't certify people that well, and they don't have much localization, right? Your famous Stanford professor is not going to care about localizing his course for a Vietnamese person or an Indonesian client, okay? Now, there's a huge skills gap in ASEAN that we can really tap into, which I think is quite important here. First, you can see that tertiary education is actually pretty uneven throughout the region. There's a reasonable rate of enrollment, but there are huge questions about, I think, quality and whether skills matches are appropriate. Not just in the region, but also in Singapore. I mean, for example, in the Philippines, they have a huge number of university graduates, but they also have a huge number of unemployed university graduates. So you can certainly create graduates, but can you create graduates who are ready for the jobs that are available for them? But we're also in the midst of a historic shift in ASEAN in general towards higher value-added jobs, towards PMET jobs. You can see, for example, that in the more developed countries, Singapore and Malaysia, already you have a pretty high percentage of the population employed as PMETs. And if you look at Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, developing ASEAN economies, you can see that they're going to get to Malaysia's level pretty soon and to Singapore's level at some point after that. Okay? And this has to be the case because when you look at developed economies, basically they all look like Singapore. Most of the people are involved in high value-added professional jobs and services which require a high level of skills and manpower training. Okay? Now, another reason why we really have to move quickly on the education front is because technological disruption is actually going to be a huge driver for demand for education as a service. Worldwide, we know that skill-biased technological change is relating to what the previous speaker talked about. Basically, if you look at, for example, at the 10 top in-demand jobs in ASEAN, it's both researchers as well as laborers. It's both the high-technology jobs as well as the high-touch jobs which are in high demand. And technological disruption is going to further increase the pace of job change. We know that once autonomous vehicles come into place, about 100,000 holders of taxi licenses, about 70,000 plus operators in the transport industry are going to have their jobs put at risk. They won't have their jobs anymore. And many of these are mature workers. They don't have much qualifications. It's going to be up to us to figure out how can we deliver to them retraining that makes sense for them. And this is a problem not just for us, it's a problem for the entire of ASEAN, the entire world, in fact. Okay? But we're going to have a pretty challenging journey ahead. Except for finance, our net trade position in services unfortunately looks a lot more like a developing country than a developed one. Okay, so I want to walk you through a bit of this. If you look, for example, at the exports of services that Singapore has as a percentage of GDP, sure, we're doing very well in financial services. We're pretty comparable to Hong Kong. If you look at charges for the use of intellectual property, which is basically payments you make either for using IP developed abroad or payments you receive for IP held by your own companies, it looks good at first, right? It looks as if we are exporting a reasonable amount of IP to other countries. But when you look at imports of services, the picture changes a lot. We're actually importing a huge amount of basically IP to Singapore, okay? And the net export position is in fact pretty bad. So if you look at the net balance of payments for Singapore for IP usage charges, you can see we actually look a lot more like a developing country. We're not in the same league as, for example, the US or the OECD, where generally they have a positive balance of payments, and that's because their companies, their firms, their individuals generate valuable IP for the rest of the world. We don't yet at the moment, okay? Now, of course, that's because we use a lot of IP created abroad in our high technology manufacturing, but this also must reflect at some level the fact that, for whatever reason, IP is not owned by Singaporeans or Singapore firms, which is found to be useful by others abroad. Okay, and surely we can work on that more. So I think our future economy must develop a competitive advantage in tradable intellectual property and business services, including predictive technologies, so mobility lifestyle, and education as a service. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Walter. Let's listen now to Dr. Francis Yeoh. Francis is a Professorial Fellow for Entrepreneurship at the School of Computing at the National University of Singapore.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes is probably something quite familiar to a lot of you. It's about the sharing economy, also known by various other names: on-demand economy, platform-based transactions, peer-to-peer economy, and so on. We are all probably familiar with at least some of these companies that are sort of mushrooming up all over the place. Probably the big icon for the sharing economy, Uber, Airbnb, also mentioned earlier by the speaker in the earlier session. This is taking the world by storm and causing a lot of headaches to governments, but a lot of delight to consumers as well as providers, because the nature of the sharing economy is that it gets everybody involved to be either a provider or a consumer or both. In the short time that we have, hopefully I can cover some of these matters, but I think I would spend a bit more time towards the end about the suggestions for a regulatory approach to this sharing economy and perhaps some recommendations to some things to think about. Okay, various definitions for the sharing economy. I think the key point, I think that is most important driving this economy is the underuse, is the ability to share underused assets or services, or in business jargon, unlocking the value of underused assets. And a number of examples there. A very recent book by this author here, Sundararajan, talks about the characteristics of the sharing economy. Right? It is largely market-based. Again, the highlighted words there that it opens up new opportunities for everything from assets and skills to time and money to be used at closer to full capacity. And it's based on crowds, networks rather than hierarchies. And because of the nature, it is very flexible. So it blurs the line between personal and professional, between fully employed and casual labor. We know why this is happening. I mean, sharing obviously is not new. Timeshare resorts, second-hand bookstores, and all. These are all elements of sharing. What is different now is that because of all these technology advances, the sharing has taken on at a level, at a scale which is unprecedented. So virtually everybody can be a participant and can benefit from this sharing economy, and that's the power of this new development. The growth obviously is phenomenal. Whether you're talking about labor platforms where people are spending time to do various tasks, or capital platforms such as renting out assets, it's growing. It's growing by leaps and bounds, and it's happening all over the world, particularly in big cities. And why is this so? Well, I think obviously when something grows very quickly, it must be because people are attracted to doing it. There are advantages, there are benefits, right? So a recent survey by PwC showed that, well, this is America, but I think the observations and numbers could well apply to Singapore. A large number of people, 3/4 of people have used some form of on-demand service, right? This is 2016. And most of them, overwhelmingly, finds it affordable, more convenient, more efficient, better for the environment, able to build community, more fun, less expensive, right? All the good things. And of course, this same respondents also believe that the sharing economy must operate based on trust, right? Overwhelming so. And 2 out of 3 thinks that since this is a peer movement, right, it comes from the ground, that peer regulation is probably more important and more effective than top-down government regulation. A writer even coined this term called internet-enabled intimacy, right? You can read that. What he's saying is that we are entrusting complete strangers with our most valuable possessions, our personal experiences, and our very lives. So we're entering a new era of internet-enabled intimacy. I thought that's a good contrast to the other phenomenon where people are just communicating with people not sitting around the table, but through their handphone with their friends outside. So this could bring the human element back. Very importantly, I think it's a very significant observation, is that a large proportion, more than about half of all the people who are players in this economy are millennials. So clearly, what this tells us is that this is something millennials like and participate in. So it's something that's going to grow, and it's going to grow big in the future. Now, why is the sharing economy ideal for Singapore? Well, in my opinion, firstly, the sharing economy is ideal in the sense that Singapore is perhaps almost the ideal place for it to take place in a big way, right? Highly urbanized, compact, dense population, which enables a critical mass so that you can get the best and the most efficient matching of supply and demand, right? Excellent ICT infrastructure, tech-savvy population, high, fast-paced work life, so people do not have time, so they need to buy services. And of course, ability and willingness to pay. Okay, we talk about the benefits. The people who, in a given transactions, the consumers, the providers, enablers, are all happy. But I think it is important to look at the benefits of the system as a whole. And I would argue that there's economic benefits as well as social benefits, right? This is economic activity because it uses existing assets, most of it anyway. It is a more productive use of existing assets, so it should raise productivity. For me, most interestingly, it provides a great platform for entrepreneurship at 2 fronts, right? You can imagine people participating in it. They are like what is termed micropreneurs, right? They are operating a business on a very small scale and part of the time. But I think that sort of mindset is important because I think it transforms the way people think, right? If you are actually running a business, however small, you naturally think about how you can make it better, how you can do it more efficiently, and that's good. Singapore has been known to be a nation of employees, and hopefully, participating in this, gives the citizens a sense that they're actually helping to create wealth, and actually they determine what they can do in their business. And of course, it's a great opportunity for startups. There are startups all over Singapore and the rest of the world trying to benefit from this big movement in which almost everything can be shared. Social benefits, environmentally friendly. It is also suitable for seniors. The earlier speaker alluded to this crowdsourcing for seniors so that it promotes active aging. And of course, for Singaporeans, it's a source of income for retirees, which is actually important, given all the information we have about insufficient retirement funds. And I would argue also that it promotes better social responsibility because once you are a player, you are a provider, as well as a user, you understand both sides better and you tend to be more responsible. And in any case, the system works by reputation and reviews. So if you want to be an active player, you have to behave yourself, right? Of course, there are risks and concerns. I think this has been talked about a lot, level playing field, chaos, tax, and so on. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about what I think would be a good regulatory approach. I think from the survey earlier showed, I think since this is a peer movement, it is best that the regulation be done on a peer basis. And the focus should be on how to enable rather than how to control. Right? And I would suggest to the authorities also that they should err on the side of liberality, not caution. That is, learn from mistakes, because when you want to stretch the envelopes, you're bound to make some mistakes. Learn from mistakes rather than having a system that avoids the occurrence of mistakes. And there are experiences from other cities. Of course, they've also just started, London, Amsterdam, so. Okay, so some concluding thoughts about what can be done. I think a lot of this are fairly straightforward. I think any civil servant worth his salt would be able to come up with a list like this. Of course, the challenge is in actually implementing them. So I'm just going to highlight two. I think an important message, if the government believes in this, is to lead by example. And indeed, there are many assets, perhaps underutilized, right, within government agencies that could be opened up for sharing. And indeed, that is the direction taken by Seoul and London. That meeting rooms, office space could be opened up for sharing. And the second one is that we should encourage startups to participate actively in providing the services and platforms, because this is where nimbleness is essential. This is where you need all sorts of ideas and experimentation, and startups are wonderful at doing this. Okay, with that, I conclude my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Francis. I think we have to move on. Please.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. Together, let us build a nation of inventors. It is vital for our survival. It is also very timely. And I say it's very timely because we are living in a very connected world. And connectivity allows knowledge sharing, allows resource sharing, and most importantly, if you are an inventor or if you are a creator of products and services, you have a direct path to the consumers, to the customers. And what this means is you can monetize your products and services, or monetize your invention in a more faster and more effectively, and most importantly, you can scale, right? So the next question is, how do we then go about nurturing inventors? For this, I think we need some help from policymakers, because if we don't do anything, we still will have inventions. We have inventions like Uber, meal delivery, or many kind of delivery services, many more to come. But these are all limited to services, limited to resource sharing, right? If you're talking about inventors, we are talking about, say, building some gadgets, building some products. It requires more than just connectivity. It requires us to build an infrastructure that will nurture inventors, and also education, right? We have to give provide the right kind of education. So how do we go about doing it? So to do that, I think let us examine what it takes to become an inventor. To become an inventor, first of all, we have to be very, very, very good in hands-on skills. And then, of course, we have to be creative. We have to have knowledge. In other words, what we need is the kind of people that can fuse vocational skill sets and academic knowledge together. Now, we do have this kind of people in Singapore. I think so. There are too few, I think. Too few compared to countries like Japan. So there are a lot of work here that we need to do. We need to, just now Prof. Loh also said we cannot leave anyone out. We need to cast our net wider to make it available to the entire population. We need to create many of such kind of people that are trained to be ready to invent, right? So if you look at our educational landscape, what it means is the line between ITE and tertiary education has to be blurred. Vocational skills that is traditionally learned in ITE has to make its way to the tertiary educated, whereas knowledge that is typically learned in tertiary education institutions have to make its way to ITE people as well. And I want to argue that this is possible. It all depends on how we teach. We probably need to do some pedagogy changes to tailor to people of different learning preferences, right? And we need to create an environment for this kind of fusion. And I think this kind of environment should ideally be on demand basis. Today, we have knowledge on demand. Everybody is using knowledge on demand. We Google, right? We Google, we get our knowledge. It's got knowledge on demand. What about skill sets on demand? It is missing in our society now, right? Not completely missing, but it's insufficient, right? So I think we need to create an infrastructure that allows skill sets and knowledge on demand, and that is, I think, the basic minimum for us to nurture inventors. We can actually get inspiration from the makers movement. Makers come in different forms, makerspace, fab lab, tech shop, for example, right? So if you look at tech shop, if you walk into a tech shop, you see all kinds of machineries, all kinds of equipment for arts and crafts, textile, woodwork, 3D printing, jewelry, computer software, computer skills, metalwork, milling machines, electronics, and most importantly, there will be people there who can teach you the relevant knowledge and teach you how to use the machines, right? So now if you have some idea of building something that requires metal, requires leather, requires plastic, for example, you need not stay at the idea level. You can actually walk into this kind of setup. Everything is under the same roof. You can pretty much convert your idea into products, right? So this is one basic minimum that I think we can do as a nation, and we can actually start with maybe one or two first, and if it's successful, and then we can slowly sprinkle a few across the island, right? Now, in parallel to building up infrastructure, we of course have to build up people, right? So one way to build up people who are able to invent will be through some of the existing policies existing efforts that we are already doing, such as lifelong learning, or make it a school CCA. Actually, some of the schools in Singapore already started to do this kind of makers thing, but it's actually smaller scale, fewer school. I think we need to do it more. There are more that we can do, right? And actually, we need not start things from scratch also. If you go to, IDA actually has got some efforts in 3D printing, in drone making, and some other things. In fact, SUTD also get Makers Fair kind of effort. So there are pockets of efforts everywhere. All we need to do is to consolidate them, make it more comprehensive, and move as a nation. And I think once we do that, once we have the infrastructure, once we have the mass, the population who are more well-positioned to invent, I think we will stand to gain many benefits from it. One of the most significant benefits, I think, is social mobility. The opportunities for creation of wealth is open to all now. If you invent, you can climb up the social ladder because there's wealth to be gained, right? And with tech shop kind of setup that we can set up, we can also introduce some kind of IP protection. Right? I do not know how many of us here watched the movie Joy. Right? This is a movie based on the true life story of a lady who encountered financial difficulty. And one fine day, she came up with an idea of a magic mop. So she invented it and she sold it and she became very successful. And in turn, she go and help new entrepreneurs. Along the way, it was a very painful thing because somebody tried to steal her idea, It was a very painful thing. But I think once we with a tech shop kind of idea, actually we can actually help to make it less painful, right? So social mobility is one thing, one big gain that we can that I believe we can stand to gain, right? The other one is active aging or active longevity, right? Retirees can actually go to these places to continue to invent, to create, and also to pass the skill sets to younger generation, right? So in summary, we can all stand to gain from a connected economy, right? And inventors can stand to gain from connected economy as well. But as a nation, we have to let things happen, right? We can actually set up tech shop kind of facilities to be a bridge between the vocational skill sets and the academic skill sets, right? And then with that we can nurture a generation of inventors and making a part of our culture. It is not realistic to think that we can turn everybody into an inventor just because we have makers lab, this tech shop, right? But I think it is realistic. It is realistic to make making as part of our culture, just like Japan, right? Now, why I say I think we need help from the policymakers is because I think we need to bootstrap ourselves. Tech shop, for example, it originated in the USA. There are a few branches. Now they have overseas branches also. Look at where they go to. They go to Paris, they go to Tokyo. They went to these places because tech shop itself is for profit. So naturally, they want to go to places where the inventive culture is very vibrant, right? Will they come to Singapore? I doubt so, because where's our inventive culture, right? So we cannot wait for people to come in, and we need to bootstrap ourselves. That's why I think policy makers can help us here. And I think if we can successfully make making become a part of a culture, we will see many successes in the years to come. Thank you very much.
You stay at 5 seconds, actually, you spend less than 10 minutes. It's impossible to do my talk in 10 minutes, as those of you have heard me. But what I want to do is to take a step back and say that many things that we heard today, I think actually there are lots of substantive content, and it does no justice to both you and them to try to do it in 10 minutes. And I would suggest that we try to follow up with the individual speakers, and the same should apply for tomorrow. And I see my role today at taking a step back and say that what are some of the interlinking features about today's session, and as we move on to tomorrow, perhaps I could give you a little bit of drink, if not food for thought, in order to survive tomorrow, which is a longer day than today, and also to ask some questions maybe. Now I personally see, and I speak in individual capacity here, of 3 critical aspects of our future economy, very much already covered by the 5 or so subcommittees in the CFE. And I call them the 3 I's. Industries is obvious, and that is highly tied with technology, whether you talk about 3D robotics, Internet of Things, or blockchain technologies, and so on. Another I that is obvious, as you will hear throughout, whether it's political leaders, private sector leaders, at universities, is about the need for innovation. Innovation in both the big I sense, right, creating areas within Singapore where there are really innovative clusters, but also innovation in the small I sense, where everything you do could be a routine. It need not be a groundbreaking technological thing, but could you do it better, think outside the box and do it differently, right? So you can think about the innovation in the big I and small I, and it's not an elitist word, and that's very important. And it's not just about all new jobs, as if all existing jobs is going to disappear overnight. It better not be, right? Because our population do not have the skills yet, to take on all new jobs in a very short time. And ultimately, I think you will hear this especially from political leaders, but maybe less so from scientists. At the end of the day, actually, we all share the same goals. It's about individuals, of course, primarily citizens, but also people living in this country, because about 1 million or more of the people are not citizens, and we have to live and coexist peacefully with them. It is about the individuals' well-being, their functioning, and the kinds of jobs that they're going to experience. And if they are not happy, and if they can't do it, everything else is going to fail. Now, the 3 obviously are interrelated, because if I'm going to bring in wonderful industries, but I have made a political stand about calibration of foreign talent, at least for some time, or foreign workers, do I have the individual Singaporean call to do it? If I don't innovate and don't build up their skills, they are not going to do it. And so is this industry that what I will bring it in now, or can I still bring it in, but then I got to beef up some things together, right? So you just can't hope. You got to actually work on this, and I don't actually envy the people having to bring all these things together, but that's what we need to do. these are the three I's that are substantive content, right? Industries, the innovation, and also about individuals at the end of the day. But I just want to say that there are three more I's I thought they are more important, not more important, they are very important that perhaps we need to give much more attention because they help us to build the ecosystem, which is the theme of this second panel, in order to support the future economy. And because they are not substantive content, it's good to take a step back and I will share with you my views from my 20 years or so working with government and also as an academic, of course, on how I think some of these things provide important challenges, but they also have good opportunities, immense ones, but also if you don't take them into considerations when you make your recommendations, all your good intentions, your good content actually not only can come to naught, but could be misleading, right? So it is a neutral, I have a neutral position on this, and I think that we are doing very well in the first I, and that's your infrastructure, and we can do much more, and there's lots of opportunities. I'll just say a few things. I think we are beginning to see the need to look at institutions, quite obviously, because we are beginning, obviously there's a lot of things that we can do, and finally, maybe we haven't been given sufficient attention to implementation, right? Because of the way that we have succeeded, I think in the past 50 years, the way that we need to look at implementation may require a little bit of groundbreaking change, so I try to say a bit of that, right? So you look at all three I's that I'm going to share with you in terms of the challenges, in terms of the opportunities, and so that when we make recommendations, we could bear some of these things in mind which may have not given sufficient attention. I'll just say three quick points for each because of time. About infrastructure, we obviously need to develop, we need to integrate them. There's both a physical and virtual infrastructure. I hope we understand that. And the first point is that as we look at everything, why shouldn't we actually realize that these are like nodes in a network? Right? You're trying to connect things together and you're trying to link them together. So whether it is a walkway, it's a transport system, it is a waste management system and a water cooling system that you read about in today's Straits Times that's really interesting. The issue here is that when you connect them together, realize that each of them should have a multi-purpose beyond the intended obvious purpose. And that when you connect them together, which are the interfacing connectors? Because if we forget about the interfacing, you could have all good intentions and they don't work together in a larger system, right? Think about it in that sense, a system perspective. I think a lot of things may take on a new perspective. The way that we use our land, whether it's floating platform that we hear, or whether it is underground, or you build upward sideways, it is important to look at their economic and social goals. But I will always say that they are not always trade-offs. Many of difficult situations actually do not involve trade-offs. It is about framing them in an integrative manner where both can actually not only not compete, but they could actually complement each other. And one of the examples is that as we go towards smart nation, it's not just about privacy. Could we actually think about some of the research that we all know in social and behavioral sciences and make sure that our smart nation is really smart? The first thing about smart nation is it's not a dumb one, right? And it is very important to ensure that your system is resilient, that whatever good aspirational things you do, you are able to have the skills to prevent negative things from happening so that you can aspire to do positive things, right? So the social behavioral sciences research, that's why it's so important now, and everybody knows that you have to incorporate them. The trick of the challenge is to incorporate them adequately. It is impossible to do at 10 minutes, but I'll try. Second point is about institutions. I won't say much about this. It's better for the university leaders to say about this. But I think we are beginning to see that the universities and research institutions such as A-STARS and many other successful centers and institutes of innovative cities and so on, there's a realization that we should stop competing and start complementing each other, stop competing in a negative sense, and begin to work together, and to realize that what you really need is that the knowledge out there, the knowledge we have is compartmentalized into disciplines, and that's the way we organize our research, the way we are trained, but the problems are not unidisciplinary, right? Now that is the motherhood statement, but if you look at it, we actually go against motherhood, right? So every day we will do things that is quite still not very multidisciplinary, and it's very important to recognize that, so that when whether our universities are not chasing after rankings, for example, that ranking is a consequence of good research and they're not the primary drivers of how you organize your structures and your processes. And one of the examples is that as we go and become more research intensive, as we want to go for top publications, those are not inconsistent goals with realizing that as publicly funded institutions and universities, there is a real need to help Singaporeans and develop our students in such a way that they have experiential learning. You already see some of this happening at NUS, NTU, SMU, and SUTD, and so on, and other universities. And the challenge here is to go beyond what we are very good at, developing analytical skills to match people's passion, people's interests, and so on. One example, obviously, is that we need to normalize our education models and not see it as, oh, SMU is doing this wonderful thing. We have this center to look at continuous education and training. No, right? I think what we should do is all institutions got to normalize it and say everybody has a seamless continuum of education, whether you are in school, off school, internship, externship, and so on. Last slide. Which is something which I thought we need to give much more attention to. And that is the way we implement all the wonderful intent we have and the wonderful content we have. Because if we don't implement it correctly, I think all good intent and content can actually lead to a quite disastrous situation. But if we do it well, I think we will have enormous opportunities and the challenges can be met. Right? So the point I'm really trying to make here is that our government policies and the way that we have been successfully functioning in the past 50 years may need some changes, the way we think and relate our public, private, and people sector. One easy example is, and I speak this dearly with URA because I'm on all the advisory boards, but the URA, for example, some of these urban policies, the HDB has their own policies, or we need to actually review some of these land use policies on zoning and to make sure that it is flexible and adaptive. Our public service is undergoing actually a wonderful transformation, right? And I can speak this well aware because I work closely with them. Many of you do. We do have an excellent public service. We actually we don't give it enough credit because good things don't get reported, negative things get reported, and the negative thing looms very large. But if you are familiar with any public services in the world, we have one of the best. The problem is because we are so successful, and sometimes internally, what was successful in the past and present may not be so future ready, right? So some of these things, the way we select our people, the way we organize the structures, the way we create the reward system, will actually need to relook to ensure that it actually is complement the future economy and not contradicts it. And the final point, which is an abstract one, and that is the so-called whole of government approach is really spelled with WHOLE. The W is about all we working together, filling which you get HOLE, a whole of government. And the whole of society means you have to bring in all the people. And I will end with this statement that when the government says during election that the government can't do it alone, I actually believe them. And that is that it is not an election ploy, political statement. Actually, they realize and they know they can't do it alone. And if we love this country, and you're not going to be a politician, and they can't do it alone, the answer is obvious, right? We've got to take up the role and do something about it. And with that, I hope you go into tomorrow's mindset with some of these eyes so that we just don't think about industries, we think about institutions at the same time, the way we implement things, and also, of course, innovation and all the eyes bringing them together, right? I know it doesn't do justice to you or me, but it's okay. We will have more time to follow up. Thank you very much.
So we have about 2.5 minutes short of 5 p.m. That entails us perhaps to ask the floor for questions. Maybe we would allow 2 questions from the floor. We can collect the questions together and then we can ask any members of the panel to speak. So two questions from the floor, please. Anyone? Yeah, we have somebody here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is William. I speak for the Maker movement and as well as the Singapore Makers Association, as well as a private company that runs a prototyping lab at the National Design Center. Referring to Prof. Ng's statements to say that, it's very interesting to acknowledge that Maker movement could be possible, a viable ecosystem that will lead to interesting future economy. But just to add on that, the tech shop model actually do work in a certain extent because we have been running a for-profit prototyping lab at the National Design Center for the last 2 years. And people do get very excited over this. In fact, Maker movement or the word maker is become so fashionable that every other university will have a maker space. Every other schools are now embracing the maker movement. But as a private sector, I have a challenge. And it could be one of the questions that maybe the panel could address as well. This is where I used to be an ex-civil servant. Now that I've gone to the other side to start this maker movement, my challenge is that my competitor now is not a private sector, it's actually the government. And I'm not too sure whether the government is doing too much, that kind of say that, I'm competing with an institution with unlimited resources. I try to get a project with National Library. I get KIV because some government agency can offer it for free. I try to go to schools, and some government agency and some science institution says that I have the budget for this, Stop going to the private sector. And as private sector guys, we are given an arm's length treatment. And it's very, very difficult to actually so-called grow this kind of stuff that we are talking about. But having said that, I want to actually make a comment. Citizens actually do care about the future of the economy. And I represent, bottom-up citizens. There are many people who actually want to do more. The only problem is that when the platform is robbed from the citizens, who can we turn to? Right, so this is basically my comment and my question. Thank you.
A very quick second question. Very quick one, very brief. No? Okay, so let's hear from the panel. I think the question is more concerned with the government as well as makers in sharing economy.
First of all, thank you for being involved in the makers movement, and I really personally hope to see more effort being done. My personal experience, I actually benefit from some of these courses that IDA at NLB conducted. They are very basic courses, but very useful to me because a lot of things I don't know, right? What I know is there are limited spaces, there are limited resources, right? And for the private sector-run kind of makerspace, I've walked into some of these. The feeling is that it is still very, because of limited resources, it is not complete, number one. Number two, it is not quite ready to take in masses, right, to serve the bigger population. So if the private sector can actually come up with something like Tech Shop and prosper, that would be the ideal solution. But we have been here for a few years, the makers movement has been a few years, and I think the kind of scale that we are seeing now is still not as big as I hope, right? So that is why I think policymakers could actually come in to help. I don't think it is I don't like to use the word rob the platform or something like that. I think we should actually think of developing private sector and government sector should actually come together and work in a synergistic way. I don't know whether that addressed some of your concerns.
David?
Okay.
I think one of the problems is not just about SMEs individual, and my answer is independent of your particular case. I think one of the problems is that the government is too successful, is too effective, and is too responsible, and that's their problem, right? And it's a good problem because I much prefer that than the one that is not effective and irresponsible. The question is that the government is, and I'm not from the government is a difficult situation, which to let go, to do less, and wish to do more. Because if you don't do more, something is going to break up and that the world is not going to wait for you. And that political judgment is very important. And the problem, not the problem, and that's where all of us got to come together because there are really some things that we know better than the government. And if we're going to self-censor, if we're not going to volunteer our work because we are shy that we won't be accepted, then we're going to have a problem. So my first point is that we got to help. We've got to all work together. And the quick second point is that please differentiate between structural issues like SMEs and all that we've got to help because if you calibrate the foreign workers and you are not careful and then things could just collapse overnight and then you can forget about all this internationalizing and so on. But change that with the fact of competition, effectiveness, and the lack of skills, right? And that's why we need to develop our people from young in terms of your passion, interest, and your skills and your innovative mindset, so that when these things don't work, there are plenty of other wonderful, meaningful things that you can work, where government is not going to compete with you, or even if they do, you're going to do better, right? So I think if you view it from that way, things will be a bit different perspective.
Okay, thanks, David. I don't think that any would you,
Can I?
Yes, okay.
Well, I think this issue is always recurring. I remember long ago there was this report and there was this yellow pages rule or something like that. If anything that the private sector could do, the government should not do. And I believe that this will continue to be so.
I'm a former civil servant, so I can sort of speak a little bit from past experience that government agencies do not seek to compete, right? So it's not what they're set up to do. In fact, they've got a lot of other things more important to do. But I think it is the nature of the economy and what I talked about earlier about the sharing economy. It's going to make things more complicated, right? Because everybody could be a provider, could be a supplier. So I don't think there's a cut and dried solution to this, except for continual engagement, because the lines are blurring all the time, right? And each time, I think you just have to adjust, to a state which is maybe stable for a while, and then later on you have to come back again. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think as David had mentioned earlier, that in the interest of time, maybe you all should go back and think overnight, and tomorrow you can ask those questions directly with them. I just want to close the session by saying that this is, in fact, a very important session because we are all caught up in this new world, a new world full of is uncharted territory. And I think it is a new world involving a lot of high-tech scenarios, and this new world may completely change the way how we do things, how we react to one another, and although it leads to perhaps more productivity, savings in cost and time, but I worry also about the non-monetary aspects. Such things as a stressful society, such things as a fast society, but not a reflective and thinking society. Because if we are thinking a reflective society, then we perhaps may fulfill more and more of the maker's economy. I have a few points that I just note down on this point. There's a fall in the family bonding relationship. Quality relationship is lacking. We have gone from the art of communications to the science of communication. Somebody mentioned about Google research. Do you know nowadays, of course, the younger generation don't read. And in terms of university students, when they do research, it's just Google research. That's what it means. So there's no in-depth primary research. So finding quiet time is a scarcity. Finding real meaningful relationship is a scarcity. Finding and appreciating the natural environment is a scarcity. So it's a big challenge for government to try to manage. While they want to move forward with all this high-tech stuff and so on, and it is important, we should be there. But at the same time, how do you manage the other things which is falling behind, and things that we actually appreciate much more in the older generation? That's why I said that the study of humanities, arts, and social sciences is very important to complement the sciences and also to try to mitigate some of these problems that may come with this kind of new economy stuff. And what about those that get left behind? It's not as simple as just saying sending them for retraining, reskilling. It's not that simple, So governments must think of a way to how to handle all these things much more. They require much more complex thinking. So with that, join me to thank the speakers for their wonderful insights, and I thank you all for turning up this afternoon.